Now let's turn our attention to a tale from ancient Israel, a story that unfolds in the wilderness during one of the most turbulent periods in biblical history. This is not a story of armies clashing or kingdoms falling. Instead, it's something far more profound, a story about how one woman's wisdom prevented a massacre, changed the course of destiny, and revealed that sometimes the greatest victories come not through violence, but through discernment. Imagine a moment when history balances on a knife's edge, when anger threatens to consume reason, when vengeance seems not only justified, but inevitable. And then imagine a single voice, calm, measured, fearless, that changes everything. This is the story of Abigail, a woman whose name deserves to be remembered alongside the great heroes of faith. While warriors are celebrated for their strength and kings for their power, Abigail earned her place in sacred history through something rarer and more precious, the wisdom to see what needed to be done and the courage to do it. Her story takes place during a transitional period in Israel's history, a time of uncertainty and violence, when the old order was dying, but the new order had not yet been born. It was an era that tested everyone who lived through it, demanding choices that would echo through generations. Chapter 1. The Wilderness King. The wilderness of Paran stretched endlessly beneath a merciless sun, a landscape of stone and dust where only the hardiest could survive. In this unforgiving terrain, David lived as an outlaw, though destiny had already marked him for something far greater. Years earlier, the prophet Samuel had anointed him in secret, pouring sacred oil over the head of a shepherd boy and declaring him the future king of Israel. But standing between David and that throne was Saul, the current king, whose jealousy had turned into a murderous obsession. David had done nothing to deserve this persecution except succeed where Saul had failed, slaying Goliath, winning battles, and earning the love of the people. The irony of David's situation was profound and painful. He had been chosen by God, anointed by God's prophet, and promised a kingdom and a dynasty. Yet he lived in caves and hid in the wilderness like a criminal. He commanded the loyalty of hundreds of brave men, yet possessed no land to call his own. He was Israel's greatest warrior, yet he spent his days running from Israel's king rather than defending Israel's borders. So David ran. He gathered around him a band of men who had also been cast out by society, those in debt, those in distress, and those discontent with the current order. They numbered in the hundreds, these wilderness warriors, and they survived by their wits and their swords in the barren places where civilization's reach grew thin. These were not simple bandits or raiders, despite what some might have claimed. These were men who had been failed by the current system, who saw in David a leader worth following, and who believed that Israel's future lay with this anointed fugitive rather than with the increasingly unstable king who sat on the throne. They were soldiers without an army, loyal to a king without a kingdom, living in the tension between what was and what would be. Despite his circumstances, David maintained a code of honor that set him apart from common bandits. When he and his men encountered shepherds tending flocks in the wilderness, they did not rob them. Instead, they protected them from raiders and wild animals, forming a living wall around the vulnerable. They asked nothing in return, operating on the ancient principle that hospitality and mutual aid were sacred bonds, especially in harsh lands where survival often depended on the kindness of strangers. This protection was not merely about being nice or maintaining good public relations, though those factors certainly played a role. It was about David's understanding of leadership and justice. He knew that how he acted during these wilderness years would shape what kind of king he would become. He knew that God was watching, that his character was being tested and refined. He knew that the men who followed him were learning from his example, absorbing his values, and becoming the kind of soldiers and leaders who would help him build a kingdom when the time came. The days in the wilderness were long and uncertain. David knew he was destined to be king, yet he lived as a fugitive. He had been chosen by God, yet he hid in caves. He commanded hundreds of loyal men, yet possessed no kingdom. This contradiction defined his existence. Anointed but uncrowned, powerful but powerless, righteous but hunted. In these years of waiting, David learned patience. He learned to trust in divine timing rather than his own ambition. Twice he had opportunities to kill Saul and seize the throne by force, and twice he refused, unwilling to raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. Even though that same anointed king sought his destruction, David would not force God's hand. He would not take by violence what had been promised to him through providence. The first opportunity came in a cave at En-Gedi, where Saul entered alone, unaware that David and his men were hiding deeper in the darkness within. David's men whispered that God had delivered Saul into their hands, that this was the moment they had been waiting for. But David refused to kill Saul. Instead, he crept forward and cut off a corner of Saul's robe, then immediately felt guilty even for that small act of disrespect toward God's anointed. When Saul left the cave, David emerged and called out to him, showing him the piece of robe and proving that he could have killed Saul, but chose mercy instead. The second opportunity came in the wilderness of Ziph, where David and his nephew Abishai crept into Saul's camp at night and found the king sleeping, his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Again, David's companion urged him to kill Saul. One thrust of that spear would end the threat forever. Again, David refused, taking only the spear and a water jug as a proof of their visit, leaving Saul alive despite the danger he represented. These incidents revealed David's character. He would not compromise his principles, even when doing so would have solved all his problems. He would not sin to escape persecution. He would not take by violence what God had promised to give him through providence. This restraint was not weakness, but strength. The strength of a man who trusted God enough to wait, even when waiting was agonizing. But patience, as anyone who has practiced it knows, can be worn thin by hardship. And in the wilderness, hardship was the only constant companion. The sun beat down mercilessly during the day. The cold crept in at night. Water was scarce. Food was uncertain. Danger lurked constantly, not just from Saul's pursuing army, but from wild animals and hostile tribes that inhabited the desert places. David and his men existed in a state of perpetual alertness, never fully resting, always watching the horizon for signs of threat. They moved frequently, never staying in one place long enough to be tracked and cornered. They relied on the hospitality of those who supported David's cause. But such supporters were increasingly reluctant to help openly, fearing Saul's reprisal. In this context of constant stress and uncertainty, maintaining discipline and morale became a daily challenge. Men who were hungry and tired could become dangerous and unpredictable. Men who felt dishonored could demand satisfaction. Men who had given up everything to follow a fugitive king needed to believe that their sacrifice meant something, that the promises would eventually be fulfilled. David understood all of this. He understood that leadership in the wilderness required not just military skill, but emotional intelligence, not just strategic thinking, but moral clarity. His men needed to see that their cause was just, that their leader was worthy, that their suffering had purpose. This is why the insult from Nabal cut so deeply. It was not just a personal affront to David, it was an attack on the entire enterprise. A public declaration that David and his men were worthless, that their protection meant nothing, that they deserved no respect or consideration. For men living on the edge of survival, Maintaining their honor was not a luxury, but a necessity. Without honor, they were just bandits. With honor, they were a kingdom waiting to be born. Chapter 2. The Wealthy Fool. Not far from where David and his men made their camp, in the fertile regions where the wilderness gave way to cultivated land, there lived a man named Nabal. His name meant fool, and seldom has a name been more prophetically appropriate. Whether his parents named him this at birth, recognizing something in his infant character, or whether it was a name he acquired later in life due to his behavior, the text does not say. But by the time we meet him in this story, the name fits perfectly. Nabal was a fool, not in the sense of lacking intelligence. He had successfully managed substantial business operations and accumulated significant wealth, but in the deeper biblical sense of moral and spiritual folly. He was a fool because he lived as if there were no consequences to his actions, as if power and wealth made him immune to the natural order of justice, as if he could treat others with contempt without eventually facing the results of that contempt. Nabal was extraordinarily wealthy by the standards of his time and place. He owned 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, a fortune in livestock that required numerous servants and shepherds to manage. His wealth came from the land around Maon, and his business operations extended into Carmel, a fertile region where his flocks could graze and multiply. To put this wealth in perspective, most families in ancient Israel might own a few sheep or goats. A moderately prosperous family might have a dozen or two. A wealthy family might have 50 or 100. Nabal had thousands. His flocks represented not just wealth, but power, economic influence, social status, and the ability to employ many people and control significant resources. This wealth had come to him through inheritance, business acumen, or some combination of both. The text does not detail how he acquired it, but it does make clear that he knew how to maintain and grow it. Shearing season, when his sheep were shorn for their wool, was a major commercial event that generated substantial revenue. The wool would be sold to traders who would transport it to cities where it would be processed into cloth and then made into garments. Nabal sat at the beginning of this economic chain, producing the raw material that fed an entire industry. Despite his material abundance, Nabal was poor in the qualities that truly matter. He was harsh in his dealings with others, seeing every interaction as a transaction to be won rather than a relationship to be honored. He was stubborn, refusing to consider perspectives other than his own. He spoke cruelly and acted without wisdom, believing that his wealth gave him license to treat others with contempt. His harshness manifested in multiple ways. He drove hard bargains with those who had to deal with him, using his economic power to extract maximum value while giving minimal compensation. He spoke roughly to his servants, treating them not as people with dignity, but as tools to be used. He ignored the traditional expectations of hospitality and generosity that were central to his culture's moral framework, acting as if his wealth exempted him from social obligations that others were expected to honor. His stubbornness meant that once he had decided on a course of action, no amount of reasoning could change his mind. He did not see this as a flaw, but as a strength of character, the ability to stand firm, to not be swayed by the opinions of others, to maintain his course regardless of circumstances. But there is a difference between principled consistency and foolish inflexibility. Nabal had the latter. He could not distinguish between standing firm on important matters and simply being too proud to admit he might be wrong. His household suffered under his character. Servants spoke of him in whispers, careful not to draw his attention or provoke his anger. Those who worked his fields and tended his flocks did so out of necessity, not loyalty. They feared him but did not respect him. They obeyed him but did not honor him. The difference might seem subtle, but it is profound. Fear can compel outward compliance, but it breeds resentment and disloyalty. Respect and honor, by contrast, create genuine commitment and faithfulness. The servants in Nabal's household developed elaborate strategies for managing his temper and minimizing their contact with him. They learned to anticipate his moods, to stay out of his way when he was in a particularly foul disposition, and to present information in ways that would not trigger his anger. It was an exhausting way to live, always walking on eggshells, always calculating how to avoid the next explosion. Nabal inspired fear, perhaps, but never respect. Obedience, certainly, but never devotion. When his servants spoke of him among themselves, it was with resignation and barely concealed contempt. They stayed because they needed employment, because their families depended on the wages he paid, because leaving would mean starting over somewhere else with no guarantee of finding better circumstances. But they felt no loyalty if circumstances changed. They served Nabal, but not willingly. In the same household lived Nabal's wife, Abigail. The contrast between husband and wife could not have been more striking. Where Nabal was foolish, Abigail was wise. Where he was harsh, she was kind. Where he acted impulsively, she thought carefully. Scripture describes her as intelligent and beautiful, but these surface qualities barely hint at the depths of her character. Abigail possessed what the ancient Hebrews called chokmah, wisdom that goes beyond mere knowledge to encompass understanding, discernment, and the ability to act rightly in complex situations. She saw not just what was, but what could be. She understood not just facts, but consequences. She could read situations with remarkable accuracy, perceiving the dynamics at play, the motivations of the people involved, and the likely outcomes of various courses of action. And this kind of wisdom is different from intelligence, though the two often go together. A person can be intelligent, able to learn quickly, to remember facts, and to solve abstract problems without being wise. Wisdom requires not just mental capacity, but emotional maturity, moral clarity, and what we might call situational awareness. It requires seeing the world as it truly is, rather than as we wish it to be, and then acting appropriately based on that clear vision. Abigail also possessed tremendous emotional intelligence. She could read people, understanding not just what they said, but what they meant. Not just what they claimed to feel, but what they actually felt. This ability made her effective in managing difficult situations and navigating complex social dynamics. She knew when to speak and when to remain silent, and when to act boldly and when to exercise patience, when to be direct and when to be diplomatic. In a household ruled by folly, she maintained an island of reason. The servants knew they could come to her when problems arose that required genuine wisdom, rather than Nabal's typical bluster and cruelty. She quietly smoothed over many situations that her husband's foolishness created, maintaining relationships with neighbors and business partners that Nabal would have destroyed through his harsh dealings. She was, in many ways, the real force holding the household together, even though her husband held the official authority. How she came to be married to such a man, we can only speculate. Perhaps it was an arranged marriage, as was common in that culture. Perhaps her family needed the economic alliance that marriage to a wealthy man provided. Perhaps Nabal had once been different, his character corroded over time by unchecked wealth and power, the way copper turns green with oxidation. Perhaps Abigail had simply done what countless wise people throughout history have done when placed under foolish authority. She made the best of an impossible situation, exercising what influence she could while navigating the limitations she could not change. The text does not give us her inner thoughts about her marriage. It does not tell us whether she had loved Nabal once or had always seen him clearly for what he was. It does not reveal whether she had been married to him for years or decades, whether they had children together, or whether she had ever tried to reform his character or had long since given up that hope. What we do know is that she had learned to survive in a difficult household, to maintain her own integrity while married to a man without integrity, to exercise wisdom even when surrounded by foolishness. Whatever the reason for their union, Abigail had learned to live with a difficult truth. She could not change her husband, but she could, when necessary, protect him from the consequences of his own folly. She had probably done this many times before in smaller ways, smoothing over an insult he had given, quietly compensating someone he had cheated, and making excuses for behavior that needed no excuse, but would create problems if left unaddressed. She would soon need to do exactly that, but on a scale she had never faced before. This time, protecting Nabal from the consequences of his folly would require not just quiet diplomacy, but extraordinary courage. This time, the stakes would not be a lost business deal or a damaged reputation, but the lives of everyone in the household. Chapter 3: The Request and the Insult. Shearing time came to Carmel, a season of celebration and prosperity. The sheep had grown their wool through the year, and now that wool would be shorn, sold, and transformed into wealth. For a man as rich as Nabal, shearing time meant the movement of tremendous value, and traditionally it was also a time of generosity when wealthy landowners shared their abundance with those who had helped them throughout the year. The cultural expectations around shearing time were well established. It was understood that landowners would host feasts for their workers, would give gifts to those who had provided assistance during the year, and would demonstrate through their generosity that they understood their wealth came not just from their own efforts, but from the broader community's support and cooperation. Stinginess during shearing time was considered shameful, a violation of social norms that could damage a person's reputation and standing in the community. David learned that Nabal was shearing his sheep in Carmel. He knew that his men had spent months protecting those very shepherds and flocks, forming a wall of protection around them in the lawless wilderness. Not a single sheep had been stolen. Not one shepherd had been harmed. The shepherds themselves had acknowledged this protection, had been grateful for it, and had recognized that David's men could have taken what they wanted, but instead had acted honorably. The protection David's men had provided was substantial and valuable. The wilderness was full of threats, raiding parties from neighboring tribes, wild animals like lions and bears, and even individual thieves who would steal sheep and disappear into the wasteland. Shepherds were vulnerable, often young men or boys armed with nothing more than a staff and a sling. The presence of David's armed warriors created a zone of safety around Nabal's flocks that would otherwise not have existed. Moreover, David's men had not just refrained from stealing. They had actively protected the shepherds and flocks from others who would have stolen. This was the service of professional soldiers, security that someone like Nabal would normally have to pay for. David had provided it for free, asking nothing at the time, trusting in the traditional customs of hospitality and reciprocity that governed relationships in that society. David's band had asked for nothing in return at the time, but now at this season of plenty, he thought it reasonable to request some provisions. This was not extortion or a protection racket, though some might try to characterize it that way. This was a legitimate request based on services rendered, framed within the cultural expectations of that time and place. David was not demanding specific payment or threatening consequences. He was simply asking, during a season of abundance, if Nabal might share some of his prosperity with those who had helped protect it. He chose 10 young men from among his followers and gave them careful instructions. They were to approach Nabal with respect and courtesy. They were to greet him with words of peace and blessing, remind him of the protection David's men had provided, and make a humble request for whatever provisions he felt appropriate to share. David's instructions were careful and intentional. He did not send his most intimidating warriors, but young men who would seem less threatening. He did not demand or pressure. Instead, he asked humbly and left the decision entirely in Nabal's hands. The messengers arrived at Carmel and delivered the message exactly as instructed. They spoke respectfully and calmly, reminding Nabal that nothing had been lost while his shepherds were under their watch. They even invited him to confirm this with his own servants before making their request for help. Their greeting was formal and kind. They wished him long life, good health, and prosperity over everything he owned. Then, with humility, they explained the situation and gently asked if he would be willing to share some provisions during this time of abundance. Every word was chosen with care. Nothing in their message was aggressive or disrespectful. Everything allowed room for honor and generosity. But Nabal's response revealed everything about his character. "Who is David?" he said. "Who is the son of Jesse?" It was not a genuine question, but a calculated insult. Everyone knew who David was, and Nabal's words were meant to diminish him. He went further, comparing David to a runaway servant, suggesting he was nothing more than a rebel without legitimacy. Then he finished with open contempt, refusing to share anything and dismissing David's men as strangers from nowhere. This was more than a refusal. It was humiliation. There were many polite ways Nabal could have declined. He could have offered an excuse or given a small token, but he chose the most offensive response possible. The messengers returned and reported everything word for word. As David listened, his expression hardened. This was no longer just rejection. It was an insult delivered in front of his men. He had acted with restraint and honor, yet he was repaid with contempt. For David, this struck deeper than personal offense. It challenged his authority and his standing before those who followed him. "Strap on your swords," David commanded. Without hesitation, 400 men prepared to march. This was no longer a request. It was the beginning of vengeance. David himself took up his sword, anger rising within him. He spoke bitterly of how he had protected Nabal's possessions for nothing, only to be repaid with evil. Then he made a solemn oath, swearing that by morning not a single male in Nabal's household would remain alive. This was no longer justice. It had become something far more dangerous. The army moved toward Carmel, 400 men advancing with purpose. Dust rose behind them as they marched, and ahead lay destruction. Everything had been set in motion. Anger, pride, and violence were now on a collision course, and it seemed that nothing could stop it. But there was one person no one had accounted for. Abigail. Chapter 4. The Wisdom of a Careful Listener. One of Nabal's young servants, observing the exchange between his master and David's messengers, immediately understood the danger. Unlike his master, this young man possessed both intelligence and survival instinct. He did not waste time trying to convince Nabal to change his mind. He knew that would be futile. Instead, he went directly to the one person in the household who might be able to act: Abigail. The servant's decision to approach Abigail rather than Nabal revealed something critical about the household. The servants knew who truly held influence, who could solve problems, and who possessed wisdom. It was not the man with formal authority. It was the woman who had earned respect through character and competence. "David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master," the servant explained urgently, his words rushing out. But he hurled insults at them. He did not pause. "Yet these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us, and the whole time we were near them, nothing was missing." He continued, emphasizing the reality of what had happened. Night and day, they were a wall around us while we were tending our flocks. His language was vivid and deliberate. A wall, constant, unbroken protection. He wanted Abigail to understand that David's request had not only been reasonable, but deserved. Then his tone shifted, growing more serious. Now think it over and see what you can do. Disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him. This final statement revealed several truths at once. First, the servant openly acknowledged Nabal's character. Even those who served him recognized his foolishness. Second, he admitted that reasoning with him was impossible. Nabal would not listen, no matter how clear the argument. Third, and most importantly, he understood that the coming disaster would affect everyone, not just Nabal himself. Servants, shepherds, and innocent lives were all at risk because of one man's pride. The servant's message contained everything Abigail needed. It confirmed the truth of David's claims. It revealed the severity of the danger. It acknowledged the impossibility of changing Nabal. And it pointed, without saying it directly, to one conclusion. Only Abigail could act in time. Abigail listened carefully to every word. While others might have panicked or despaired, her mind moved quickly, assessing, calculating, deciding. She knew David's reputation. He was no ordinary man. He was a warrior who had defeated giants and led armies. She also understood the immediate danger. 400 armed men could destroy everything in a matter of hours, and she knew her husband well enough to understand that appealing to him would change nothing. But Abigail perceived something even deeper. David was not merely a leader in the wilderness. He was the man chosen by God, the future king of Israel. The prophet Samuel's anointing, though done in secret, was known among those who paid attention. David's victories, his preservation despite Saul's pursuit, all pointed to divine favor. To insult such a man was not just unwise. It was profoundly dangerous. Yet Abigail also understood David's character. He valued justice. He had shown restraint before, sparing Saul when he had the chance to kill him. He maintained discipline among his men and protected rather than exploited the vulnerable. This was not a man beyond reason. This was a man who could be reached if approached wisely. She made her decision immediately. There would be no consultation with her husband. That would only waste time. Instead, she would act, take responsibility, and trust that wisdom could accomplish what force could not. Abigail moved quickly and decisively. Time was critical. Every moment brought David's men closer. She ordered provisions to be gathered in generous quantities, not as a token gesture, but as a true expression of respect. 200 loaves of bread, when enough to feed many. 2 skins of wine, not cheap but worthy of the occasion. 5 sheep already prepared. Large quantities of roasted grain, practical and sustaining. 100 cakes of raisins and 200 cakes of figs, valuable and nourishing. This was abundance, not reluctance but generosity. Abigail was not merely trying to escape danger. She was correcting a wrong. Where her husband had shown contempt, she would show honor. Her choices were also thoughtful. These were supplies that David's men could use immediately. Food suited for the wilderness. She understood not only the need, but the people she was addressing. The provisions were loaded onto donkeys, forming a visible caravan. Anyone who saw it would understand its message. This was not a threat. This was peace. She instructed her servants, "Go on ahead. I will follow." The plan was intentional. The gifts would arrive first, creating a moment of impact. Then she would come, ready to speak after the initial tension had begun to ease. The servants departed at once. Abigail said nothing to Nabal. There was no point. He would either refuse or ignore her. Either way, time would be lost. This moment required action, not permission. Some might question her decision. Was she stepping outside her role? Was she being disobedient? But wisdom recognizes hierarchy of values. Preserving life outweighs formality. Preventing harm matters more than preserving appearances. Abigail understood this clearly. Doing what was right mattered more than doing what was expected. She mounted her donkey and set out toward the wilderness, alone yet determined, riding toward the danger that threatened her entire household. As she rode, she likely prayed for wisdom in her words, for courage in her approach, for favor in David's eyes. She knew everything depended on what she would say. She also prepared her words carefully. She would need to acknowledge the wrong without defending it, to calm anger without dismissing it, to appeal to David's sense of destiny without sounding presumptuous. Every sentence would matter. Every tone would matter. She was riding to meet a man she had never met, a man leading 400 armed warriors, a man who had sworn an oath before God. The stakes could not have been higher. One wrong word could lead to destruction. But Abigail understood something powerful. Wisdom often succeeds precisely when the situation seems impossible. And she was about to prove it. Chapter 5. The Meeting in the Ravine. The geography of that fateful encounter is significant and worth pausing to consider. Abigail rode down into a mountain ravine, a place where the land itself created natural walls on either side, focusing attention, limiting distractions, and creating a kind of natural amphitheater where every word would carry weight and importance. Ravines in that region were formed by seasonal water flow, carved over centuries by occasional flash floods that rushed through during the rainy season. During the dry season, they became natural passages through the mountainous terrain, shadowed by steep walls on either side, cooler than the exposed hillsides, often the quickest route between locations, but also potential places of ambush. And there, coming from the opposite direction, till she saw them, David and his men, 400 warriors, armed and grim-faced, marching with the purposeful stride of men committed to violence. At their head was David himself, still burning with fury from insult and betrayal. They had come too far to turn back easily. The momentum of anger carried them forward, and the oath David had sworn gave that momentum the force of sacred obligation. Imagine the visual impact of that moment. Abigail, a woman alone on a donkey, riding toward an army. The contrast could not have been more stark. 1 against 400, peace against war, wisdom against fury. Any reasonable person would have been terrified. But Abigail's courage came not from the absence of fear, but from the conviction that what she was doing was right and necessary. When Abigail saw David, she acted quickly, her movements deliberate and controlled. She dismounted from her donkey and bowed down before him with her face to the ground, the deepest form of respect and submission in her culture. This was not weakness, but strategy. She immediately diffused any perception that she came in defiance or pride. She acknowledged David's authority and position. She showed humility without groveling and respect without losing dignity. The act of dismounting and bowing forced David and his men to stop. They could not simply march past a woman prostrated in their path. This gave Abigail her opening, creating the space for words to be spoken and heard. Then she spoke, and in speaking she demonstrated why wisdom is sometimes called the highest gift, why Solomon asked God for wisdom above all other things, and why the book of Proverbs presents wisdom as more valuable than gold or silver. "Pardon your servant, my lord, and let me speak to you," she began, her voice steady despite the danger. "Hear what your servant has to say. Please pay no attention to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. And as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my Lord sent." Notice the structure of her opening. She asked permission to speak, showing respect for David's authority, even though he had no formal authority over her. She referred to herself as "your servant" multiple times, positioning herself under his care rather than as an adversary. This was strategic. By doing so, she appealed to his responsibility as a leader. She immediately disavowed her husband's actions, calling Nabal what he was, wicked and foolish. She did not excuse him, did not soften the truth, and did not ask David to understand his perspective. She simply acknowledged reality. At the same time, she clarified that she had not been present when the messengers arrived, establishing that she bore no personal responsibility for the insult. This was not an excuse, but a necessary distinction. In just a few sentences, Abigail accomplished multiple things. She showed respect without weakness. She acknowledged wrongdoing without defending it. She separated herself from her husband's actions, and she laid the foundation for everything that would follow. But she did not stop there. "And now, my Lord, as surely as the Lord your God lives, and as you live, since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, may your enemies and all who seek to harm you be like Nabal. And let this gift, which your servant has brought, be given to the men who follow you." This was masterful. She invoked God, not as a threat, but as a reminder. She reframed the situation, suggesting that David had been kept from bloodshed by divine intervention. This allowed him to step back without losing honor. She did not deny his anger. Instead, she redirected it. She also presented the provisions as a gift, not payment. This restored dignity to the exchange and allowed David to receive it without feeling manipulated. Then she continued with even greater boldness. "Please forgive your servant's presumption. The Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my Lord, because you fight the Lord's battles and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my Lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling." Here Abigail revealed her understanding of David's destiny. She knew he would establish a lasting kingdom. She spoke not with doubt, but with certainty. She affirmed his identity as one who fought the Lord's battles, not as a rebel or outlaw. And she subtly warned him, unnecessary bloodshed would contradict that identity. Her imagery was powerful. David's life was secure in God's care, like something precious wrapped and protected. His enemies, by contrast, would be cast away like stones from a sling, a clear reference to his victory over Goliath. The message was clear. God would deal with his enemies. David did not need to take vengeance himself. Then came the turning point. "When the Lord has fulfilled every good promise concerning you and has appointed you ruler over Israel, my Lord will not have on his conscience the burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. And when the Lord your God has brought you success, remember your servant." This was the heart of her appeal. She shifted David's focus from the present moment to the future, not if, but when he became king. She asked him to imagine looking back on this day. Would he want to remember it as a moment of wisdom or regret? She spoke of the burden of needless bloodshed, acknowledging that such actions leave lasting weight on the conscience. Even justified violence carries weight, but unnecessary violence leaves scars that do not fade. She appealed not to fear, but to identity, not to anger, but to purpose. She never directly criticized David. She never told him he was wrong to be angry. Instead, she elevated him above the situation. She showed him a better path. Her final request, "Remember your servant," was simple, humble, and wise. It carried no demand, only trust. Throughout her speech, Abigail demonstrated extraordinary wisdom. She spoke boldly, yet respectfully. She addressed the immediate crisis while pointing to deeper truth. She offered a solution without diminishing David's honor. Most of all, she spoke to who David could become, not just who he was in that moment. And sometimes that is what changes everything. Chapter 6. When Wisdom Dissolves Fury. David stood silent as Abigail spoke, listening to every word. The men around him watched, probably with some surprise, wondering how their commander would respond to this unexpected intervention. They had been marching toward violence, committed to an oath, convinced of the righteousness of their cause. Now here was this woman speaking words that challenged everything they had been thinking, offering a perspective they hadn't considered. The moment stretched, balanced between violence and peace, between the momentum of anger and the pull of wisdom. David's next words would determine whether 400 warriors would turn back or continue forward, whether an entire household would live or die. Then David spoke, and in his words, everyone present heard the sound of anger, transforming into something else entirely. Not disappearing, but being redirected, being elevated, being refined into something better than blind rage. Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me, David said, his voice carrying a note of wonder, as if he was only now fully recognizing how close he had come to disaster. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak. These words revealed several truths about David's character and about what had just happened. First, David recognized divine intervention. God had sent Abigail to stop him. And this wasn't just a lucky accident or a clever woman taking initiative. This was providence, divine orchestration, God actively working to prevent David from making a terrible mistake. Second, he acknowledged that Abigail had saved him from bloodshed, not saved Nabal, that's what we might expect him to say, but saved David himself. He understood that he was the one who needed saving, that he was the one about to commit an act he would regret. The violence would have stained him more than it would have hurt Nabal, who would have been dead and beyond regret. Third, he confirmed what he had intended to do. The slaughter would have been total. Not one male would have survived. He didn't soften this or try to minimize it. He stated it plainly, acknowledging the full extent of what he had been about to do, owning the reality that his anger had been leading him toward mass violence. Fourth, by speaking these things aloud before his men, David demonstrated the kind of leadership that would eventually make him a great king. He didn't try to save face by pretending he hadn't really meant it, didn't minimize his anger or the oath he had sworn. Instead, he publicly acknowledged that he had been wrong, that he had needed correction, that this woman's wisdom had been greater than his fury. This is what wisdom does in the presence of anger. It doesn't deny the anger or call it invalid. It doesn't argue against the reasons for the anger or suggest that the offended party should just get over it. Instead, it provides perspective, appeals to deeper values, offers a path forward that preserves honor without requiring violence. And wisdom acknowledges that anger can be righteous while still recognizing that righteous anger can lead to unrighteous actions. It creates space for people to change course without losing face, to redirect their energy toward better ends without denying the legitimacy of their feelings. David accepted the provisions Abigail had brought, a visible sign that he was accepting her entire message, not just taking the food while continuing with his original plan. "Go home in peace," he told her, his voice now calm, the fury drained away. I have heard your words and granted your request. Those simple words contained multitudes. David acknowledged that he had truly heard her, not just listened to the sounds she made, but understood the wisdom she was offering. He had heard her with his mind and his heart, had allowed her words to penetrate past his anger to touch something deeper in his character. And he granted her request, which was nothing less than the lives of everyone in her household. 400 warriors who had sworn to kill every male in Nabal's house would now return to their camps without having shed any blood. Servants who would have died for their master's folly would live. Shepherds who had done nothing wrong would continue tending their flocks. An entire household was saved because one woman had the wisdom to act and the courage to speak. With those words, the crisis ended. The immediate danger passed. 400 warriors who had been marching toward massacre turned around and headed back to their wilderness camps. The machinery of vengeance, once set in motion, had been stopped by the intervention of wisdom. The men began to disperse, probably with mixed feelings. Some might have felt relief. Killing an entire household isn't something most people want to do, even when they're angry. Some might have felt disappointment. They had worked themselves up for violence and now had to let that energy dissipate without release. Some might have felt admiration for David, seeing in his willingness to change course evidence of the kind of wisdom that makes good leaders. Some might have gained new respect for the power of well-spoken words to change outcomes that seemed inevitable. Abigail had accomplished the impossible. With no weapons except words, with no authority except her own moral clarity, with no power except the power of truth spoken well, she had prevented a tragedy. She had saved her household from death. She had protected David from a decision he would have regretted for the rest of his life, and she demonstrated that the right words, spoken at the right time in the right way, can accomplish what armies cannot. As she prepared to return to her household, Abigail must have felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that the immediate danger had passed, exhaustion from the intensity of what she had just experienced, perhaps some trepidation about what she would face when she returned home and her husband learned what she had done, but also surely a deep satisfaction in knowing that she had done the right thing, that she had acted according to wisdom and conscience, that she had saved innocent lives through her courage and skill. The sun was likely getting lower in the sky by now. The shadows in the ravine would have been lengthening. And Abigail mounted her donkey and began the journey home, back to a household that had no idea how close it had come to annihilation, back to her husband who was probably still celebrating his shearing feast without any awareness of the disaster that had been averted. She rode home carrying the knowledge that she had changed history. Though she probably didn't think of it in such grand terms, she had simply done what needed to be done. What her wisdom told her was right, what her conscience demanded. She had demonstrated that one person, acting with courage and wisdom at the right moment, can change outcomes that seem inevitable, can redirect the course of events, can prevent tragedies that others thought were unstoppable. Chapter 7. The Fate of Folly. Abigail returned to her home in Carmel as evening was settling over the land, and the dust of David's departing army had settled behind her. The crisis had passed, but she now faced a different challenge, dealing with her husband and the aftermath of what she'd done. She found Nabal hosting a feast, and the description Scripture provides is revealing, a feast like that of a king. This detail tells us much about Nabal's character and self-perception. He wasn't content to have a normal celebration. He had to display his wealth, had to demonstrate his status, had to make sure everyone understood just how rich and important he was. He was drunk, celebrating his wealth and his shearing season, completely unaware that his household had come within hours of annihilation. While Abigail had been racing to intercept David's army, while servants had been loading donkeys with provisions in desperate haste, While 400 armed men had been marching toward them with swords drawn and death in their eyes, Nabal had been drinking wine and congratulating himself on his prosperity. The scene would be almost comical if it weren't so tragic. A man completely oblivious to the danger he had created through his own foolishness, celebrating in ignorance while others saved him from the consequences of his actions. He had no idea that every person at his feast owed their life to his wife's wisdom and courage. He had no idea how close he had come to destroying everything through his stubborn pride. Abigail said nothing to him that night. There was no point in trying to communicate with a drunk man, especially one as foolish as Nabal, even when sober. She had learned through long experience that some conversations are futile, that some moments are wrong for truth-telling, that wisdom includes knowing when to speak and when to wait. So she waited through the night, waited through his drunken revelry, waited for morning when sobriety might make understanding possible. We can imagine her during those hours, exhausted from her journey and the emotional intensity of her confrontation with David, but unable to rest, knowing that she still had to face her husband, still had to tell him what she had done, still had to deal with the aftermath of her actions. When morning came and Nabal had sobered up, his head probably aching from the previous night's excess, Abigail told him everything. She didn't soften the truth or minimize the danger. She explained about David's messengers and his own contemptuous response. She described the 400 armed men who had been marching toward their home with sworn intent to kill every male in the household. She detailed her intervention, the provisions she'd taken without his knowledge or permission, and her meeting with David in the ravine. She made absolutely clear exactly how close they had all come to death, how his foolish insult had nearly cost everyone their lives. The news had a dramatic and immediate effect. Scripture says that Nabal's heart failed him, and he became like a stone. This description suggests either a stroke or some form of shock so profound that he became paralyzed, unable to move or speak. Medical historians have speculated about the exact nature of Nabal's condition. Perhaps a massive stroke, perhaps a heart attack, perhaps a psychological shock so severe that it manifested as physical paralysis. Whatever the medical mechanism, the meaning is clear. The man who had been so certain of his own importance and invulnerability, who had been celebrating with royal pretensions just hours earlier, suddenly came face to face with the consequences of his folly. The reality of how close he'd come to death, the understanding of how his own actions had nearly destroyed everyone and everything he possessed, the humiliation of learning that his wife had to save him from his own stupidity. All of this crashed down on him with crushing force. Some speculate that what killed Nabal was not just physical shock, but spiritual and psychological devastation. He had built his identity on his wealth and status, on the illusion that his riches made him untouchable and superior. Now he had to confront the reality that his wealth meant nothing in the face of real power, that his status hadn't protected him, in that he had been completely vulnerable and had been saved only through the intervention of the wife he had probably treated with contempt. For a proud man, a man whose name meant fool, but who probably believed himself quite clever, this realization might have been more devastating than any physical blow. His entire self-image collapsed. Everything he had believed about himself and the world was revealed as false. And unlike physical injuries, which can heal, damage to one's fundamental sense of self can be fatal. He lingered for about 10 days in this condition, neither dead nor truly alive, existing in some twilight state between the two. We don't know if he was conscious during this time, if he could hear or understand what was happening around him, if he experienced this time as suffering or simply as a kind of blankness. The text is spare in its details. telling us only that he remained like a stone for approximately 10 days. Then he died. The text simply states that the Lord struck Nabal and he died, leaving the exact mechanism ambiguous but the meaning clear. Nabal's death was connected to his character and his actions. God's justice had found him. The consequences he had created through his own foolishness had finally caught up to him. When David heard that Nabal was dead, his response revealed his character and his understanding of what had happened. He didn't gloat over the death of an enemy. He didn't celebrate that someone who had insulted him had suffered and died. Instead, he praised God and acknowledged how God had worked in the entire situation. Praise be to the Lord who has Praise be to the Lord who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. David continued, his voice now steady, no longer driven by anger but by clarity. He has kept his servant from doing wrong and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head. In those words, David revealed something profound. He understood that justice had been done, not by his hand, but by God's. The insult had not been ignored, and the wrong had not gone unanswered. Yet the response had come without unnecessary bloodshed, without innocent lives lost, and without leaving behind the burden of regret. In that realization, there was a quiet kind of victory, greater than any victory won by the sword. Not long after, David sent word to Abigail, the woman who had stood alone in the ravine, who had faced an army with nothing but wisdom, and who had spoken truth into the heart of fury, changing the course of events. He asked her to become his wife. This was not merely a gesture of admiration, but a recognition of her discernment, her courage, and her ability to see clearly when others were blinded by emotion. Abigail accepted, and so the woman who had once lived in the house of a fool entered into the future of a king. There is something deeply quiet in the way this chapter concludes. There is no grand celebration or dramatic proclamation, only the unfolding of consequences. A foolish man undone by his own pride, a wise woman lifted into a new beginning, and a future king spared from a decision that would have marked him for the rest of his life. Beneath it all runs a truth that moves gently but powerfully through the story. Wisdom does not always shout. It does not force or overpower. Sometimes it arrives at the right moment, in the right voice, with the right words, and changes everything. If one lingers over this story, another layer begins to emerge. Abigail did not control the outcome. She could not command David, undo her husband's actions, or guarantee success. All she could do was act with clarity, speak with courage, and trust that truth, spoken well, would find its place. And it did. There are moments in every life that feel like that ravine, narrow and tense, balanced between two outcomes. Moments when anger feels justified, when reaction seems inevitable, when the path forward appears already decided. And yet, those are often the very moments when wisdom matters most. Because sometimes the difference between destruction and peace is not strength, not power, not force, but a single voice willing to speak before it is too late. Chapter 8. The Quiet Legacy of Wisdom. The story does not end with Nabal's death or Abigail's new beginning. In many ways, those events are only the visible surface of something deeper, something that continues long after the immediate crisis has passed. What remains is not just a sequence of actions, but a pattern, a quiet revelation about how wisdom moves through the world and how it shapes the lives of those willing to follow it. David returned to his wilderness life, but he did not return unchanged. Moments like the one in the ravine do not simply pass through a person without leaving a mark. They settle somewhere deeper, becoming part of the inner framework through which future decisions are made. The memory of how close he had come to unnecessary bloodshed and how he had been turned back not by force but by truth spoken with clarity would remain with him. In time, David would face many more decisions, some far more complex, some far more costly. He would stand on battlefields, sit on a throne, carry the weight of leadership over an entire nation. And yet, beneath all of that, there would always be the echo of that earlier moment, a reminder that power alone is never enough, that strength without restraint can become destruction, and that the ability to listen may be as important as the ability to act. For Abigail, the change was more immediate, but no less profound. She moved from a household defined by folly into a life aligned with purpose and direction. Yet it would be too simple to see her story as merely a reward for wisdom, as though her actions had earned her a better future. The truth is more subtle than that. Wisdom did not guarantee ease or comfort. It required her to step into danger, to act without certainty, to speak when silence might have been safer. What it did provide was alignment. Her actions matched what was right, even when the outcome was not assured. And in that alignment, there is a kind of stability that circumstances alone cannot offer. She did not wait for a safe moment to do the right thing. She recognized the moment that required her and stepped into it. There is also something worth noticing about how quietly everything resolves. There is no public recognition of what Abigail did, no crowd gathering to celebrate her intervention, no official acknowledgement of the lives she saved. The servants knew, David knew, but beyond that, the world moved on, as it always does. He carrying forward countless stories that never become widely known. This is often how wisdom works. It does not always leave behind monuments or visible markers. It changes outcomes in ways that cannot always be traced back to a single moment. A decision made in private prevents a tragedy that never becomes public. A conversation held at the right time redirects a path that would have led to destruction. The absence of disaster rarely draws attention, and yet it may be one of the greatest outcomes wisdom can achieve. In contrast, folly tends to demand attention. It is loud, reactive, driven by impulse and pride. Nabal's life was full of visible signs of success, wealth, feasting, status, and yet beneath all of that was a fundamental instability. His decisions were not anchored in understanding, but in self-perception, in the need to assert importance without recognizing reality. When the consequences came, they came swiftly and decisively, revealing how fragile that foundation had always been. The difference between these two paths is not always obvious in the moment. Wisdom can appear quiet, even hesitant. It pauses, considers, weighs possibilities. Folly, on the other hand, often appears confident. It acts quickly, speaks loudly, asserts itself without doubt. To an outside observer, it may even seem stronger. But strength is not measured by volume or speed. It is measured by what remains after the moment has passed. Abigail's words remained. They reshaped the future. They preserved life. They altered the course of a man who would become king. Nabal's words, by contrast, led only to collapse, leaving nothing behind but a brief warning embedded in the memory of those who witnessed it. There is a lesson here that extends beyond the specific details of this story. It speaks to the nature of influence itself. Not all influence comes from authority or position. Not all power is visible. Sometimes the most significant impact comes from those who are willing to step forward at the right moment, to speak with clarity, and to act without being asked. It also speaks to the importance of timing. Abigail did not act too early, when the situation was still forming, nor too late, when it would have been irreversible. She acted within a narrow window, a space where intervention was still possible. Recognizing that kind of moment requires attention, awareness, and a willingness to respond quickly once it is seen. For David, the willingness to listen was just as important as Abigail's willingness to speak. Without that openness, her words would have had no effect. Wisdom offered can still be rejected. Truth spoken clearly can still be ignored. The outcome we see in this story depends on both sides, the one who speaks and the one who chooses to hear. This balance is easy to overlook. It is tempting to focus only on Abigail's courage, but David's response is equally significant. He allowed himself to be interrupted. He allowed his anger to be questioned. He allowed a different perspective to enter a moment that had seemed already decided. That kind of openness is not weakness. It is a form of strength that is often harder to practice than decisive action. As the story settles into its conclusion, what remains is not a dramatic ending, but a quiet understanding. Life continues. Decisions lead to consequences. Character reveals itself over time, not in isolated moments, but in patterns of response. Some will continue to act like Nabal, confident in their own judgment, dismissive of others, unaware of the risks they create. Some will learn slowly or suddenly that such a path cannot sustain itself forever. And some will choose a different way, a way that values discernment over impulse, humility over pride, and understanding over reaction. The story of Abigail and David is remembered not because of a battle that was fought, but because of one that was avoided. It is remembered because it shows that the absence of violence can be as meaningful as its presence, that restraint can shape history just as surely as action. And perhaps that is the quiet legacy this chapter leaves behind, that in a world often driven by urgency and reaction, there remains another path, a slower path, a more deliberate path, one that listens before it speaks, considers before it acts, and understands that the most important victories are sometimes the ones no one sees. Chapter 9. The Weight of a Single Choice. Every story, no matter how quiet, leaves something behind. Not always something visible, not always something that can be measured or recorded, but something that settles into the fabric of what comes next. A shift, a direction, a consequence that continues long after the moment itself has passed. The story of Abigail and David is no different. At first glance, it may seem like a simple account, a conflict that was avoided, a foolish man who faced the outcome of his actions, a wise woman who intervened at the right time, a future king who chose restraint over revenge. The events unfold, resolve, and move forward. But beneath that surface lies something far more enduring. It is the reminder that history is not shaped only by grand events or public decisions. It is shaped again and again by moments that could have gone another way. There was a moment when David could have continued forward. The path was already set. The men were prepared. The anger was justified. The outcome seemed certain. No one would have been surprised if the story had ended in violence. In fact, many would have expected it. And yet, it did not happen. Not because the circumstances changed, not because the offense was undone, not because the power to act was taken away, but because in a single moment, a different choice was made. That is where the weight of this story truly rests. Not in what happened, but in what did not happen. An entire household lived because one man chose to listen. A future king was spared a burden he would have carried for the rest of his life because he allowed wisdom to interrupt his anger. And a moment that could have been remembered for destruction became something else entirely. A quiet turning point that redirected the course of events. It is easy to underestimate the power of such moments. They do not announce themselves. They do not arrive with certainty or clarity. Often, they feel like interruptions, like delays, like obstacles to what we have already decided to do. But sometimes those interruptions are the very thing that prevents irreversible outcomes. Abigail understood this. She did not wait for a perfect opportunity. She did not assume that someone else would step in. She recognized the urgency of the moment and acted, even without guarantees, even without protection, even without knowing how David would respond. Her choice carried risk. She could have been ignored. She could have been dismissed. She could have failed. And yet she acted anyway. Because wisdom is not only about knowing what is right, it is about having the courage to move toward it, even when the outcome is uncertain. David, in turn, faced a different kind of decision. He had already chosen his course. His anger had direction. His men were following him. Everything was in motion. To stop, to listen, to change direction in that moment required something more difficult than continuing forward. It required humility. It required the willingness to admit that he was about to make a mistake. It required the strength to choose a different path, even when it meant letting go of something that felt justified. That kind of strength is not always visible. It does not look like victory in the traditional sense. There is no enemy defeated, no territory gained, no immediate reward. But over time, it becomes clear that such choices carry their own kind of weight. They shape character. They influence future decisions. They define the kind of person someone becomes. This is why the story endures, not because it is dramatic, but because it is familiar. Everyone encounters moments where anger feels justified, moments where the easiest response is to react, to push forward, to follow through on what has already been set in motion. Moments where listening feels like weakness and restraint feels like loss. And yet those are often the moments that matter most. The moments where a single decision can determine whether something breaks or is preserved, whether something ends or continues, whether something is lost or protected. The weight of a single choice is not always felt immediately. Sometimes it unfolds slowly, revealing its impact over time. A decision made in one moment becomes a pattern becomes a direction, and a direction, repeated often enough, becomes a life. In the story of Abigail and David, we are given a rare glimpse into that process. We see the moment before the decision. We see the intervention. We see the choice. And we see the outcome. But more importantly, we are shown that the outcome was not inevitable. It could have been different. And that is what gives the story its lasting power. It reminds us that even in moments that feel fixed, that feel already decided, there is still space for something else. A pause, a voice, a shift, a different choice. And sometimes that is all it takes.